I didn't. I don't even know my one grandfather's name. That's on my dad's side now. And my grandmother and grandpa on my dad's side owned a farm in Whitehall, Wisconsin, which is a little ways out of La Crosse. And they had 5 children. No, 6. Oh, 6. My dad, who was Clarence Davison. That was my dad. And then the youngest boy was Gordon. And then they had, the rest were girls. And they named them, these are given names, Leafy, Fairy, Hazel, and who did I leave out? Daffodil, yeah.
I called her Daffy.
Daffodil.
I called her Daffy or Daffodil.
Oh, Daffy.
Everybody called her Daffodil.
Leafy, Fairy, Gordon, Hazel, Daffodil.
I grew up with my grandma and Daffodil. Well, my grandfather, he liked to drink a little bit. And he would work all day in the fields. They had a nice farm. In fact, I went out there with Hazel one time. She knew the way. And when we pulled in the yard, a younger lady came out, and we introduced ourselves. And she says, come here, she said. She took me over to the granary, and in the granary there's a post. And on the post, my dad had carved his name, Clarence David Davison. That was interesting to see. Anyhow, he used to do a little drinking, so he would come in and have his supper, and then he would hitch up an old horse that they had, and he would take it down to the local tavern in Whitehall. And he would stay there until after dark. And when he came out, all he would do was to drop the reins down on the floor, and he'd say, "Get up!" And the horse knew its way home, and it would walk home. And so it would stop at the barn, and when it got to the barn, when it would wake him up, he would get out and unhook it, put it in the stall, and go into the house. Well, this one time, the horse came running into the barn and stopped. And my grandmother, she heard this, and she thought, well, there's something wrong, and he didn't come into the house right away. So she went out and looked, and the seat was empty, and she looked in the barn and called, and no answer. So she come in and got my dad, got him up, and said, something's happened to Pa. So they went out looking for him. They got about halfway to Whitehall, and here he is laying in a ditch. And what had happened, they surmised what happened. He got in, of course he goes to sleep right away, and about halfway home a fox or something jumped out and scared that horse. And that's what they call a runaway, when the horses run wide open. And so he wakes up and he knows he's on a runaway. He jumped, and when he jumped stiff-legged, and he drove his legs up through his hips and up into his body. So they put him in the wagon, they got him in there, and they took him right to the La Crosse hospital. Well, my mother was a nurse, and she was working at the La Crosse hospital. And so that's how my dad met my mother. Because he went to visit, of course, his dad, and they finally got married. And my grandmother could not take care of the farm by herself. And so she sold the farm, and she bought a boarding house in La Crosse, down by the railroad tracks. She had a lot of boarders, mostly men there that were working on the railroad. And she had, of course, 4 built-in servants, the girls, and the youngest boy was still home, and he kept the wood boxes full for the fire. Then my dad, he got a job with the railroad, and he worked in St. Paul so my mother and dad moved to St. Paul, and they rented a big house there. And my dad, the boarding house wasn't doing all that great, so my dad invited his mother, my grandma, and the girls and the Gordon to come and live with him. And because there was a lot of jobs in St. Paul. So he went to St. Paul. They came up then, sold the boarding house and came up. And they lived there and worked there about a year or so. And then my dad, he wanted to get a little bigger, and he wanted a small farm. So he started looking around. He found a house in North St. Paul. And it had a barn, it had a chicken coop, and it had a milk house, and a pump house. Those were the buildings. And then he owned 8 or 10 lots. I forget how many were there. So they moved to North St. Paul. They had a cow and I guess they had a horse for a while, but I never got involved with that. Anyhow, that's where I was born, upstairs in a bedroom in that house. And then my grandmother, she kind of wanted to get a separate house, so she had one built across the alley from where this house was that I was born in. And my Aunt Daffa, they moved in there. There's a very small house. It has one bedroom, one small kitchen upstairs, and then a living room. And the living room is where, of course, where they put that baby grand piano that you have. Mm-hmm. And Daffa was a piano teacher. She taught classical music. And they moved down there into the new house. And of course, my folks, they lived up there by themselves with Hazel and whoever was left that didn't get married. They finally all got married and left, the girls. And Daffa and my mother went to the state fair one year, and while they were there, they got to talking to some people that were selling hamburgers, and they saw how much money they were making selling hamburgers. So they decided next year they were going to open up a hamburger store at the fair, which they did. The next year they opened up that, and then they got to talking to some carnival people, and they found out that the carnival people were making pretty good money with the concessions. So they decided that maybe next year they would try that and make more money. And that's what they did.
And this was Daffa and who?
No, this was my mother.
Oh, your mother.
And Daffa, yeah.
Right, okay.
My mother and Daffa. And then they came back and they talked to my dad and whatnot, and so eventually they decided, maybe, my mother and dad decided that they should go on the carnival circuit instead of just the state fair, because it was making good money. So that's what they did. They went out and they had the concession, and that's how they got into the carnival business. Well,
What year was this?
I was, of course, growing up, I was, 3, 4 or
30s.
so. So my dad, he bought a truck. You remember now? This started way back in the 1800s when my grandmother lived on the farm. So now we're back to where my dad bought an old truck, Model T truck, and he was going to haul coal in the wintertime, because they didn't go out in carnival in the wintertime, and they went out on the carnival in the summertime. So then he had a job steady, and so that's what they did. Well, then my dad made a little money, and he thought he'd go into cahoots with another guy. His name was Keogh. He was an advance man for a carnival, and the carnival owner there wanted to sell it. So my dad in Kehoe bought this carnival. And now remember, there was really wasn't any trucks to go over the road at that time. All carnivals were moved by railroad. They had horses that would move the carnival onto the wagons, and then the wagons onto the flatbeds. And there was one car that was a passenger car on the railroad. So they traveled several years that way, and the spark from the engine caught the first car behind the passenger car on fire. And they were out of St. Louis a ways, and of course there were no fire engines. It was all horse and buggy stuff. The whole train caught fire except the passenger car. I still have a picture, in fact it's on the desk in there, of the passenger car. And it says on the side of it, it says Kehoe and Davis Shows.
Oh.
So they went back, just started over again with concessions. And about that time, I'm ready for school. So, and my folks just closed up the house, and they stayed down in the south, and then I moved up with my grandma and Daffa, and I went to school there. So I was with my grandma and Daffa 3 months, and in the summertime, I went on the carnival. And I was on the carnival for 3 months every year until after I graduated. And the kids really envied me because being on a carnival, it was just terrific. I could ride any ride or see all the sideshows and talk to all the people. I got to know all the carnival people, and carnival people those days, I don't know how they are today, but those days they were nice people, very nice. I knew every one of them, and got along real nice with them. And then on my mother's side, well, I should have told you, when my dad moved to St. Paul, he changed the name to Davis. He just cut the son off. So all your Davises here were Davisons at one time. So on my mother's side, my grandfather there, his name was William Heileman. And he owned the ice house in La Crosse. It was a huge ice house. They cut the blocks of ice in the wintertime and hauled them into the ice house. They filled the ice house with they laid straw between the layers for ice. And then he was pretty well heeled. He had some money. He had a beautiful, great, big home, like some of those you'll see if you ever go through La Crosse. They had a maid and everything, and he always had a bow tie on and a suit, always. And nobody ever called him Bill or William. He was Mr. Heileman. he was pretty well known. He didn't deliver the ice or anything. He had people come and buy ice at wholesale from him. So it was a pretty fair business that he had. But a storm came along, and the lightning hit the ice house, set it on fire. And of course they called the fire engines, or there was no engines, it was horses. And the horses were on the way to put the fire out when, as they went by the church, the lightning struck the church and set the church on fire. So they stopped and put the church fire out, and they let the ice house burn to the ground. And of course, those days nobody had insurance on anything. It was, insurance kind of was unheard of. So anyhow, he lost everything he had there, but he had a little money, so they lived there. And finally, they came and lived in North St. Paul with my folks for a while. And then he passed away there, and my grandmother went then and lived with an aunt, my Aunt Eleanor, back in La Crosse. My grandfather and grandmother there had Dorothy, and my mother Esther, and Eleanor, and Helen, and Walter. So they were kind of scattered around between St. Louis and La Crosse. So, and you'll notice I didn't send out any Christmas cards to any of you because I knew you were all going to be here, and I wish you a Merry Christmas when you got here. And I look at the money I saved.
Yeah.
Jesus, stamps are damn near 50 cents and cards are 50 cents. My,
Cards are $2.
oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
$2.
You see, you save money, why, you can have a little fun. So I got a little fun here. I got some cards here. Got the same thing as I gave you last year. There's checks in here for $10,000 for Chris.
Oh my God.
That was not necessary at all.
There's $10,000 for Billy
Wow, thank you, Grandpa.
Thanks,
Dad?
Dad.
and $10,000 for Kenny.
Thank you very much.
Ah, you're
Wow.
More
welcome.
than needed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very much appreciated.
And I do have $1,000 here for Connor.
Hey, Connor! Yay!
Grandpa's
The check
got
is
presents.
made out.
Cha-ching.
The check is made out for Corey because I knew he couldn't sign his name. Connor.
Connor, Grandpa's got an envelope for you.
There you go.
Say thank you.
Yay!
Put that for your college fund now.
No, Papa.
He doesn't understand.
No.
Then I have some checks here
He'll-
for the grandchildren.
Oh my gosh.
Grandpa, you did not have to do all this.
There's $5,000 for Amy,
Oh my gosh!
first and only girl.
Oh.
One for Jeff.
You did not have to do that, Grandpa. Thank you.
Alright.
And one for Kyle.
Oh, Kyle.
And Corey. And then I think these are for, the last two are only for $1, I think.
We didn't get
Look at
one.
their faces.
Brian and Brandon, $5,000.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
What a college student needs.
Pretty,
Now you got some gasoline now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
made it a pretty
Boy, do you
special
need that, Brian.
That gas hog won't be too much of a problem for a while,
Pretty,
Brian.
I'm almost considered selling.
pretty special Christmas for everybody.
Very special Christmas, Grandpa.
We're glad you saved your money.
Yeah, good.
You did not have to
Thank
do that,
you.
but thank
Now
you
I'm
so
broke.
much.
We don't want you to have to sell the house now.
Good gosh.
I got tears coming because I was going to buy a new Cadillac, you know.
There it goes.
Now he's driving a Chevy.
Now you're driving the Chevy.
Now I'm shot.
That's very, very nice.
Very
Thank you
nice.
so much, Grandpa. That was
Thank you, Grandpa.
You're all
awesome.
welcome.
unbelievable.
I got such a nice family, you know. I don't have any alcoholics. Nobody's got divorced. And no dopers. No smokers. It can't be any better.
Here, here.
You take a family this big, and I've
Surely
always
so
told
much.
Linda that, I don't know of any family that I know that can make those four statements.
That's right.
Yeah.
There isn't one.
No.
Not one that I know of.
Bill, plus you got a pastor in the family.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
That
That's
means
right.
We have to take back $3,000 of that dollars back.
Yeah.
But to add to that, on a serious note, that is extremely awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dad.
Very
Yeah.
important part of life. Yes.
We
Thank you
appreciated
very
the
much.
story. That was a great story.
Yeah, yes.
Get that on tape.
The whole thing.
I got it on
I like
audio.
the name Griddle. I think that's
That
cute.
good?
Right?
That's good.
Something we'll never forget, Grandpa.
Yeah.